Well, again, good morning, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started so that our speakers today can have the most time with you. My name is Sharon Rigsby. I am co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee at Columbus Realtors, alongside my colleague Raquel Ludaway over at Keller Williams Consultants. I am with Coldwell Banker Realty. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, as well as the Government Affairs Forum, led by Chair Tony Macaluso with Coldwell Banker Realty. A couple of quick housekeeping items for you all today. Today's discussion is being recorded and will be sent to all participants here in the coming days. Also, we do have a Q&A session planned for you as well. So please, throughout today's presentation and discussion, drop any comments or questions you have in the chat, and we will do our very best to get to as many of those as possible. So today we have two wonderful speakers, City of Columbus attorney Megan Kilgore and Dr. Stephanie Moulton, professor and faculty director for research at John Glenn College of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University. Allow me to introduce our first speaker, City of Columbus Auditor Megan Kilgore. Megan Kilgore was elected City Auditor of Columbus on November 7, 2017, and took office on January 1st, 2018. The Office of the City Auditor includes the offices of income tax, financial reporting, debt management, accounting and operations, payroll services, and financial systems for the City of Columbus. Auditor Kilgore is also an adjunct professor at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University, where she teaches a graduate level course in public finance. Auditor Kilgore is a frequent speaker at industry conferences around the Midwest and is a founder of Ohio Women in Public Finance. Now, that is a very brief bio of our auditor, so I will drop the link in the chat to her full bio, as well as our other speaker as well. So I am happy to introduce to you today, City of Columbus Auditor Megan Kilgore.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Fair Housing Month. And Sharon, thank you for that warm welcome. I've been watching names roll in onto my screen, and I'm delighted to see Sharon Young, and I hope it's the same Sharon Young who sold me my very first house. I think I was, oh gosh, I was young, Sharon. And I sold that house. How I wish I still had it, given the evaluation and growth of where that first house was located. But anyways, today I'm here and I'm delighted to be able to host you through a really interesting conversation. As Sharon mentioned, I am the Auditor of Columbus. And I'm sure many of you, probably all of you, are very familiar with the county auditor. Our roles, as Sharon mentioned, are quite a bit different. Here at the city, I oversee the revenue side. I don't have anything to do with the property taxes that my colleague down at the county, Stenziano, does. So here at the city, I'm the revenue side. The mayor and the council are the expenditure side. We really have tremendous checks and balances here. And as Sharon mentioned, we have a really large office, which includes that division of revenue, where we collect over $1 billion a year. We do all the financial reporting for the city. We do investor relations, debt issuance. As you know, the city uses bonds usually to pay for its big capital projects. And we have several other functions that support, let's say, the day-to-day of the city of Columbus. One of the things, a touch point to you as realtors, when I came into office, I immediately noticed that we had a very antiquated system for collecting income tax. Later this year, we'll be launching a new state-of-the-art system for paying and filing your taxes, including short-term rental taxes. Our intent is to make it as easy or easier for you as using TurboTax. And I do hope it makes your livelihoods, frankly, a little bit easier. I know how busy things have been for you as realtors. Given the number of folks on today's call, though, and I think especially the correlations that you're seeing in the real estate market, I did want to spend a couple of moments to give you an update on how we're doing financially as a city. So what I'm going to do is share my screen briefly, and I'm going to talk you through a quick economic update. Right off the bat, what is important to know is that we are a AAA rated city. As individuals, all of us on this call have credit ratings, right? It's how we get our levels of mortgages, rates, and so forth. Cities have the same thing. The city of Columbus, a fun fact, is actually the largest city in America to have a perfect credit rating. We are what they call a AAA by all three of the major agencies. What that means to you is that not only is our fiscal foundation strong and worthy of continued investment, especially from corporations looking to relocate or build new here in the city, but it also means the value of your tax dollar can go really, really far here. To give you an example, think about just mortgage rates. Higher the credit rating that you have, the lower your mortgage rate. Same thing applies with us. So the fact that we are a pure AAA government as a city means that we get to have the absolute lowest cost of borrowing. So we can do more projects with, frankly, fewer tax dollars. This is a huge, huge, huge accomplishment for a large, especially growing city. And to that, I think this is just a perspective check that I always like to start with. We were the only city in the Midwest, as you all know, given the number of miles I'm sure you've put in your car the last couple of years, the only city in the Midwest to grow by more than 100,000 persons. There were only 14 cities in the entire country who grew within the 2010 and 2020 census. And you'll note 5 of those cities were in Texas. So Columbus, this is really my day-to-day acknowledgement. We are a fast and we are a growing city, but I think where you'll find us differ is that we have a lot of capacity and we have a lot of strengths in our financial foundation, which will allow us to grow, hopefully really thoughtfully. Quick tidbits as to how we're doing as a city. Income tax, believe it or not, which is our primary source of revenue, about almost 80% of the city's general fund, our main pot of money where we fund all of our essential city services, about 80% comes from income tax. And we are up 11% in the first quarter of 2022. The reason for that is because of a lot of wage inflation, as well as extremely strong bonuses that were given out in January and especially in February. We had a lot of stimulus still from the federal government. So while there is real economic growth and new jobs coming online, high wage paying jobs, factually, we start looking at this period of time as remote work shifts our revenues out to the suburbs. As you know, you pay income tax in Ohio where you're physically doing the work. So as we look at increasing trends of remote work or just more permanent trends, we are anticipating to see some of those revenues from the city shift to those suburban communities where people are staying home to work. So we're starting to see those early impacts of remote work, but what's really important is that a lot of it's being masked by these really high wage growth statistics, federal stimulus and the like. Real jobs, though, are occurring, even though we have a gap in where we were at the end of 2019. So I want to speak to that because I think this is probably the most important slide to share that really explains what's happening here in Central Ohio. So a lot of numbers on this page. You'll see these are the numbers of jobs here in Columbus by industry. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the industries. Look at the category called 2019. At the end of 2019, we had 579,824 jobs filled. Those were jobs that were completely filled and paying, taxes into the city of Columbus. In 2020, with the COVID pandemic, we dropped, as many of you are aware, 4.5%. So we went from 579 to 553. 21 was a slight rebound where we ended the year about 2.2% up. So at 565. So here's the kicker. We have 11% growth as a result of the factors I've just mentioned, but we're still 14,000 jobs fewer than we were at the end of 2019, pre-pandemic. So as auditor, part of one of my core duties is to set the revenue estimate for the city. These 14,000 individuals who are either because of choice or because of factors such as that are fixable, things like lack of access to childcare, lack of access to, just skilled labor. This type of focus is paramount to everything that we're doing here in the office, is focusing on those 14,000 individuals who have not regained either employment or who have chosen not to since the end of 2019. As I mentioned, the new types of growth that we are experiencing are sizable, and they're really high wage paying jobs. So 3 categories where I'm seeing the most job growth: technology broadly, healthcare, and financial insurance. We're all very aware of our ecosystems here in Central Ohio. They are so large that they're actually producing other offshoots, including new, like, high-tech biomedical engineering, 3D printing for types of healthcare. And in addition to having record revenue years, they also had some record wage and hiring years. So the ecosystems, I use that term very intentionally, the ecosystems of those healthcare systems are really powering a lot of things, including venture capital-based new companies. These VC companies, which I'm sure some of you are working with, these employees of these companies, they're sizable. We had some record-breaking years of new, really big idea companies blossoming, and a lot of funding, especially in the last couple of years, to support those big ideas. So on the right-hand side, for those of you who are able to see the screen, you see the magnitude of some of these major new companies who have established massive employment bases in Columbus. And Drive Capital alone, venture capital funded portfolio of companies, we can acknowledge they've created about 3,000 jobs in 2021 alone. So really, really big numbers. Most important, I think for me to convey to you is that we don't have to give away suitcases to get people to want to move to Columbus. We have all this, we have a lot of economic growth, we have a lot of jobs happening. So to really hone in on what I'm focused on, it's the very uneven recovery. And so we know, for example, that investments in childcare, investments in education, and frankly, keeping people in their homes through the COVID crisis, about $50 million went out alone from the city to support rental and utility assistance. That was critical. That's, especially for a city that's driven by income tax and powered by a strong tax base, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more that we do to help people be successful, the more we will be successful at the city of Columbus. So the Columbus Promise is something that you're going to see a lot more from. That's ensuring that every Columbus City School graduate has an opportunity to get a full-time or a part-time degree from Columbus State for free. That's a huge investment in our community. From a capital plan, with this, all this, kind of growth of our Central Ohio community, the city's capital plan right now is about 74% public utilities. I wanted to share that with you because you probably hear from time to time with economic development concerns about the use of water, where water is going, how we're growing regionally. And in our capital plan, a 4th water treatment plant is planned for in the northern side of Columbus, actually over in Delaware County. But transportation, water, sewer, little bit of rec and parks, those are the key areas for the city's capital plan investment in the next few years. While we do have these investments, affordability though is really key for us. And from a water and sewer rate comparison, this is the newest data that we have access to. I wanted to show you kind of where we shake out. Columbus we actually provide water and sewer to a much more metro form around the region, far outside of the boundaries of the city. We pick up a lot of suburbs, and we try and focus on the best quality, services as possible, while also maintaining affordability. So Columbus shakes out right in about the middle in the Midwest, and on the lower side on sewer. So we're pretty pleased. In the last 5 years, our utility rates have averaged a 2.8% increase. And that's a testament to that AAA rating at the beginning. That's keeping those costs low. Part of my job is to maintain kind of a constant SWOT analysis, always thinking about our strengths, our opportunities, threats, and so forth. And a huge strength and a huge opportunity and a huge threat all in one are all the big developments that are forthcoming, including Intel. I would be remiss if I did not, of course, mention the word of the year. What I'm focused on, though, for me at the City of Columbus is how the jobs are going to be filled at Intel. And what excites me about Intel especially is that 50% of the jobs only require a high school diploma. I call this a GED to a PhD type of employer. That brings me a lot of comfort, especially as we look to build out our tax base really thoughtfully. Income levels around here will rise. There is no doubt about that. And the salaries that are being driven at Intel, as well as the university's new innovation district, will help carry that. Innovation district alone, 12,000 jobs, about 4 billion in anticipated market value over almost 300 acres. Sizable investment. And those jobs are all here in Columbus, which is pretty tremendous. Planning ahead for all of this, these are things that, again, on that SWOT analysis, I think are strengths and also huge opportunities. So for example, the Columbus Airport still has a lot of capacity. My good friend who runs it, Joe Nardone, he is building a new terminal in the coming years, which will be a game changer. It'll allow for sizable new investment. Mobility-wise, you've probably seen Link Us. If you haven't, check it out. There's a full website. That's the new, very Columbus, Central Ohio-wide transportation plan. And then I also should mention Amtrak. As you know, probably just hearing in the news, Amtrak's CEO really wants to move to Ohio. We want him to too. So for those of you who can see the screen on the bottom right, that's a rendering of what the new Amtrak station at the convention center could look like. I could speak to you about Amtrak and the opportunities, but as realtors, just think about if the Amtrak stations do go forward, and this is rest with the state has to commit to their investment. But if this goes forward, this is going to open up a proposed station in Delaware. This could certainly alter what we think of as a typical commute into Columbus in very different ways. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And then I'm going to kick back over to the main screen. And I am going to segue now. And if any of you have questions about what I just shared, drop them into the chat. I'd be delighted to answer them at the end. But today's topic is really inspired by the conversation that I had, thanks to Brent Swanger with the Realtors Leadership Academy several months ago, where we talked about the power of bringing light to inequities. Areas where, thanks to new capabilities of data collection, we're able to see things that we need to do better. The housing market can be difficult to navigate and certainly compete in. You all know this. You have been on the front lines desperately trying to help your clients find a home within their price range. No one knows how tough it is like you do. And you also know that when you factor in the issue of race and socioeconomic status, the situation becomes more complicated. It's been 54 years since the Fair Housing Act, yet racial inequality remains pervasive in certain areas of real estate and the mortgage industries. Here in the office, we have the redlining maps of Columbus up because they factually show present day inequities. History is a good truth teller. We've seen the federal government. I printed off some articles recently to understand some of the other research around the country too, but the federal government's really leaning in right now. And for example, looking at bias in appraising homes, that task force is co-chaired by Ohio's own HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge. But we also have one of the best housing experts in the entire country here in our borders. And I'm delighted to spend the morning with Stephanie Moulton. Stephanie is a friend. I would say she's a mentor in terms of the teaching areas that she is an expert in at Ohio State. By day, she's a professor there at the Glenn College. And her middle name, I'm pretty sure, is research. That is what she is known for around the country. And at the Glenn College, she's the faculty director of research, where she likes to deep dive into subjects like housing, consumer finance, population. But unlike some academic scholars, Stephanie has a lot of real-world experience working in the day-to-day housing field. She worked for a nonprofit where she designed and managed housing development programs at the state and local levels. So now here's what we're going to do. I'm going to turn things over to Stephanie. She's going to walk us through some of the latest research, hot off the press, and then I'm going to come back and join for some conversation. But during Stephanie's presentation, you're going to have questions. Drop them into the chat. I think Ida and a few others, Kelsey, will help us keep track of those. and then we'll get back to those questions during the Q&A. So with that, Stephanie, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm very excited to be here to share just a slice of research. And I was given 20 minutes to talk, which if you know me or you know professors, that's sort of a tough challenge, but we're going to do this in 20 minutes. So I want to talk about the cost of inequality on real estate and really engage with, kind of building on what Auditor Kilgore said about some of the systemic issues that have exacerbated inequality here in Central Ohio, but also in the nation related to housing. And, I'm going to talk about a couple of different things. So many of you as real estate professionals are aware of all of the challenges of getting people into homes. And we often focus on that. And I want to talk about that for sure. But I'm going to share some research that's also on what the inequalities for homeowners, particularly homeowners of color, after they purchase their home. So there's still inequalities that persist even after you've crossed that hurdle into buying. And I'm going to highlight some research that we're doing actually with Ohio Housing Finance Agency on some of those inequalities. So this is so I'll be sharing some of that today, but please do jump in the chat with some questions. So first, just to frame up the issue. You're in the business of housing, so you know this. But homeownership in our country, for better and worse, is the primary form of wealth. So what I've got here, this is a graph. This is actually drawn from the Survey of Consumer Finances, and on the x-axis you have incomes of individuals, and on the y-axis we have how much housing makes up their net worth. And what you see is that the median homeowner has 40 times the household wealth of a renter. So $254,900 for the homeowner compared to $6,270 for the renter. So there's huge inequality here between homeowners and renters and how much wealth they hold. And you can see this across the income distribution. The orange bar is showing you how much of their wealth is in their home. And until you get to be about $200,000 of income, the majority of your wealth is held in your home. So this really highlights, for better and worse, in our country, home ownership, owning a home, buying a home has been the vehicle towards wealth creation. And if we have inequalities in how people access that source of wealth, then we're going to just exacerbate the overall wealth disparities. And so this is just showing you by race. And so we also know that there's huge disparities by race in how much wealth people hold in the United States. So on the left side, I'm showing you by Black and white households. Black households or white households have 10 times the amount of average wealth as white households. And much of this goes back to housing. And so much of this is going to come back to that prior graph I just showed you, where a lot of that equity or the wealth is held in their homes. See a similar thing for Hispanic households in the United States. White households have 8 times the amount of wealth as Hispanic households. And again, a lot of this is because of systemic disparities in access to home ownership. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. This is an Urban Institute chart. They have some really interesting charts on inequality that kind of paint this stark picture. And a lot of this can be traced back to redlining. Even despite the fair housing law passing more than 50 years ago, we still have persistent disparities in the rate of homeownership between white and Black households in our country. Depending on the area, we're talking about a gap of 20 to 30 percentage points between the white and Black homeownership rate. It's huge. This is here in Central Ohio. Actually, this was from the Ohio Housing Finance Agency. The gap in Ohio is about 40 percentage points between white and Black households. It's huge. It's quite large. And there's also a gap, and we could say, well, there's many things that contribute to this gap. And as real estate professionals, I'm sure you're already thinking of all of the reasons why this gap exists. And I'll talk about that in a second. Part of it too is access to mortgages and access to mortgage financing. And so we see that this is the denial rate of people who apply for a mortgage using HMDA data. And the denial rate for, even if a person kind of overcomes that barrier, is ready to purchase a home, they're much more likely to be denied if they're Black than somebody who's white, 16 percentage points more likely here in Ohio. So what are the things that help us explain this racial homeownership gap? Historic discrimination in housing and credit markets are number one. So the redlining maps you mentioned, the ability to pass on wealth from generation to generation, and particularly right now where many purchases are cash transactions, or you have to bring in cash to kind of make up that appraisal gap financing. Households that have had systemically less wealth and less intergenerational wealth over time don't have that cash to bring to the table, and they get shut out of a competitive housing market. So the historical discrimination is exacerbating these disparities. We also think about lower levels of income and income volatility, which again trace back to many of these systemic disparities, but that makes it harder to qualify for mortgages, and then it makes it harder to hold on to the mortgage once you have the home. Credit scores, access to credit, using credit scores in underwriting, that can make it more difficult. There's actually a study that shows that for Black and white households, credit scores are actually noisier for Black households. They're less predictive of risk. And so if we use that same credit score to underwrite a mortgage, we're actually, disparately impacting a Black household who may not be as high of a credit risk with a 620 credit score as somebody else, but there's a lot more noise in the credit score, a lot more variation. So it's not clear that that's the best measure. We also think about lack of trust and lack of information. A lot of homeowners are first generation homeowners, reduced access to financial institutions, neighborhood segregation, lack of affordable housing supply is a huge issue here in Central Ohio. I have a graph I'm not going to show, but just showing the house price appreciation in Columbus relative to other areas. Again, many people are being outcompeted in the market. But one of the things I want to call attention to today, which maybe is something that as real estate professionals we haven't thought as much about, is the disparate exits from home ownership due to default and foreclosure, and kind of the ability to maintain that home. And I would say, even if it's not exiting the home, it's how once we get somebody into a home, how they're able to manage that home investment in order to maximize wealth. So we saw that wealth was making up a big portion or housing wealth makes up a big portion of total wealth for most people. But we actually have inequities in how people are managing or using that wealth once they get into homeownership. And I'm going to focus on that a little bit. So this is actually a paper that I'm working on with actually a former undergrad student, Katie Vasali, as well as Matthew Dean. He's a PhD student at OSU. And we're working with Ohio Housing Finance Agency. And we're trying to look in Ohio at racial differences in the take up of forbearance during COVID-19 and refinancing behaviors among low-income homeowners. And, I'm going to just give you, here's just kind of a motivation graph. This is from a colleague of mine at the Philly Fed. And on the left side, we're going to look at the refinancing rates. So this is the share of people with a mortgage that refinanced. And you all know that we had record low interest rates during 2020. So mortgage interest rates were really low, and even into 2021. And so we had a lot of refinancing activity. The blue line is the share of Black homeowners who refinanced their mortgages. The black line is the share of white homeowners, non-Hispanic white homeowners who refinance their mortgages. You have a huge gap in the refinancing rate. So Black homeowners much less likely to refinance. Why does this matter? Because in many cases, Black homeowners are just as creditworthy and just as eligible to refinance, but they're not. And if they don't refinance, they might end up with an interest rate that's even 2 percentage points higher than an otherwise similar white homeowner. They're paying hundreds of dollars more in a monthly mortgage payment than a white homeowner, and they're not building wealth as quickly because more of their monthly payment is going to interest. So this just exacerbates that disparity I talked about. Even if we get people into homes, if we have this refinancing gap, that makes it that exacerbates the problem. The other graph I'm showing you is forbearance rates. And so forbearance was an amazing lifesaver for many people. Actually, 15% of households with a mortgage in the US were in forbearance at some point or another during the COVID pandemic. As real estate professionals, you probably know what forbearance is, but essentially if a homeowner had trouble making their mortgage payment during COVID, or even if they didn't have trouble, but they had an income shock or some sort of shock to their household, they could request forbearance from their lender, particularly if they had a federally insured mortgage. Although many of the private sector, private label mortgages also offered this. But basically, this lets you not make a mortgage payment for 6 months, and you could get an extension up to 12 months and even 18 months where you didn't have to make your mortgage payment. This is a wonderful thing, and it prevented foreclosures, mass defaults. But on the other hand, now we're coming out of that. And so part of what we're looking at is who's still in forbearance, and what are we going to do with the 18 months of missed payments that people might have? And if this disparately was used by people of color, is that going to further exacerbate the wealth inequalities I just mentioned? So you see here that Black homeowners, the blue line on the right, much more likely, almost 20%, at a given point in time in forbearance on their mortgage payments relative to white homeowners, about 10% of them in forbearance at some point on their mortgages. So we have this huge gap. And again, good thing that we have forbearance, but we have to think about what that's going to mean for wealth creation over time. So what happens when people exit forbearance? So this was actually, and I just looked at a graph, I should have updated this. I have a new stats as of April, but back in October of last year, about half of the people that exit forbearance start making their payments again. So they exit forbearance, they're doing fine, they stay homeowners. But about a quarter of them pay off their loans. And that's, you have a strong housing market. So somebody's still having trouble making their payments, or they still have an income shock. And we have a strong market, you can sell your home. But what does that mean about, exits from homeownership? Is that what we want people to? I mean, on one hand, we're avoiding foreclosure, but on the other hand, we could be having exits from homeownership that are going to even exacerbate that inequality more. And then we have some that are basically go back into forbearance. Once the forbearance ends, they actually end up, or they're in a loss mitigation situation. So we've got to keep a close eye on what's going to happen here. This is actually as of April of this year. This is nationwide. This is showing us the percent of people as of April, so this month, April 7th, that were either in a non-payment status on their mortgage, or were in forbearance, or were in loss mid. So these are people who aren't currently making their mortgage payments. And you see a huge disparity by race. So non-Hispanic Black households of mortgage holders, about 7% of them are in a situation where they're either still in forbearance, they're in loss knit with their lender, which means they're working something out with their lender based on being past due, or they're delinquent on their mortgage. If you look at non-Hispanic white, that's 3%. So there's a huge gap right now. And this is something that we need to keep our eyes on. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have another foreclosure crisis, because housing values are strong, but we could have disparate exits from homeownership for people of color, which is just going to make the problems worse in our communities. So we wanted to look in Ohio at low-income homeowners and see what's happening here in Ohio. And so we partnered with Ohio Housing Finance Agency and we're looking at a pool of affordable mortgage borrowers that bought loans through Ohio Housing Finance Agency's program. Many of the real estate professionals on this, I'm sure, work with that program. Would love to get your feedback on it at some point or chat with you about that. But in any case, they provide affordable financing to low-income borrowers. And we're going to see what do we see in this local program here in Ohio in rates of forbearance and refinancing among Black homeowners. And there's reasons why we might expect differences, differences in borrower characteristics, differences in loan products, but also, you could have differences in servicing. And we're going to hold a lot of those things constant by looking at the same program. So a lot of this is really, we're going to try to figure out, is there a racial difference in the take-up of these things here in Ohio? And we're again focusing on Ohio Housing Finance Agency's program. As many of you know, it serves low and moderate income homeowners, oftentimes first-time home buyers, although you don't have to be a first-time home buyer. They're all 30-year fixed rate mortgages. They're all serviced by the same mortgage servicer. So it's not just like one servicer happens to be better at telling you than another. They all have the same servicer in this program. Later, we're going to add in some income data to look at income shocks and how that might relate to this, because as you know, there were also inequalities in who experienced an income shock during the COVID crisis. Women and people of color were more likely to experience an income shock than white men during the crisis. And so that could also contribute to some of what we're seeing. But again, we're focusing on Ohio Housing Finance Agency's program. It's an affordable mortgage program, tends to have interest rates that are at or below market, and they also tend to provide down payment assistance that can help overcome that barrier of becoming a first-time home buyer. We're going to look at people who purchased homes from 2015 to 2019 through this program, about 24,000 of them. And then we're going to look at those who are still active on their mortgage as of January 31st, 2020. And we're going to see what happens to them. Are they making their payments? Are they in a forbearance situation? Were they able to refinance? And to do that, we're going to use data from the servicer, which in this case is US Bank. And we're going to see what's happening at an individual level with these loans. And as I mentioned, we're going to be bringing in some wage data as well eventually here. But just some descriptive trends here. So this is that non-payment status, which basically means that of this pool of homeowners here in Ohio, what share of them are either not making their payment and are delinquent, or are in a forbearance situation. And the blue line are the Black homeowners in the program, and the red line are the white homeowners in the program. And you see that same gap that I showed you with the national pictures at the beginning. We have that same gap here, where we have Black homeowners that were much more likely to be in a non-payment status than white homeowners. Although we are seeing it kind of close, at least in this affordable mortgage program in February, where the gap is getting back to be similar to what it was going in. So there's still a gap, but it's a little bit smaller. Much of this is driven by forbearance. So we had a much higher take-up rate of forbearance among Black homeowners here in Ohio, Black low and moderate income homeowners, than we did of white homeowners. Again, similar to national trends. And we're still seeing a slightly elevated rate of Black homeowners still in forbearance relative to white homeowners. But this does raise questions on what's going to happen upon exit from forbearance for this group of individuals. Non-payment is literally they're in default on their mortgages. And we, over time, we actually see the gap between Black and white individuals in our sample who were in default on their mortgages was higher before the pandemic. It closed during the pandemic because a lot of individuals were able to get forbearance. So it was a very good thing to prevent default. And we're actually still at a point where it hasn't kind of widened back up again. So on the default side, which might be a precursor of foreclosure, we're not seeing evidence of massive foreclosures coming our way, which is a good thing. But we still need to think about the forbearance and refinancing. So this is the prepayment gap. The red line are again, non-Black homeowners, and the blue line are Black homeowners in our affordable mortgage program here in Ohio. And we see the same kind of gap where even among the same exact program, same exact servicers, same exact loan terms, you have a much higher rate of refinancing among the individuals who are white during a time of historic low interest rates relative to the individuals who are Black. And then we do a model, which I'm not going to go into much detail on, but basically we want to hold constant lots of things. So let's make your credit score the same. Let's make your income the same. Let's make everything about you the same. And let's see if we still see this differential. Is it just driven by different credit scores and incomes? Or is there something else here? And so what we see is that, being Black actually has a 45% increase in the probability of entering forbearance, holding everything else constant, income, credit score, loan amount. And it has a 29% decrease in the probability of prepaying your mortgage during this period, which again, much less likely to refinance, even holding constant things like credit score and income. And then if we look at what happens when people exit forbearance by race, we see that the Black homeowners were actually less likely to prepay upon exit from forbearance, so they're more likely to still be in their home. So that could be good, but they're also not as likely to refinance. So there's this huge reduction in the rate of refinancing upon exiting forbearance. May not be getting to be able to take advantage of some of those lower interest rates that were available, and they're also more likely to be current. We looked at some kind of characteristics of Black and white homeowners in this Ohio sample who were in forbearance or who had exited. Black homeowners were more likely to be in forbearance longer. They tend to have less of a mortgage balance decrease upon exit and more of an increase in their balance upon exit, partially due to more payments being paid. And the more amount of the mortgage payment decrease is pretty small. It's not significantly different. So just to give us some discussion here about what all this means. So even in in the context of this really affordable mortgage program where we're holding constant all these characteristics that we otherwise might think, oh, it's just the servicer who's not telling you to refinance. We have the same servicer, we have the same interest, the same product. We see that Black borrowers were significantly less likely to refinance their mortgages in a time of declining interest rates. They were more likely to be in forbearance and stay in forbearance longer, and are more likely to have an increase in mortgage balances upon exit. But they were not more likely to be in default, which is a good thing. So if there's a silver lining here, we don't expect a massive, onslaught of foreclosures to be happening disparately like we did with the last recession. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't worry, because we still have a gap in the wealth creation that might be coming out of this forbearance crisis. So I think we need more focus on really the back end of homeownership. So not just getting people into homes, but figuring out how, once somebody is into a home, particularly if they're first generation homeowner, how do we make sure that they have the strategies for building wealth just like everybody else in that home? So knowing when to take advantage of the lower interest rates. There's some discussion of this role for automatic stabilizers. Why don't we just automatically refinance individuals with low and moderate incomes when interest rates drop, particularly if the goal was to get people into affordable mortgage programs? Is there a way that we could make this more automated? And I would also say, like, as we're thinking about something like, many of you have heard of HAF, the Homeowner Assistance Fund that Ohio Housing Finance Agency has, and actually each state has. That is actually providing people with a subsidy. So it's not just forbearance where we're basically saying you don't have to make your payment. It's a subsidy that could be used to pay back those past due payments that you missed. That could actually be really important and really valuable to help prevent this kind of wealth disparity impact of COVID. So encouraging your homeowners that might have been in distress or might have used forbearance to seek out HAF could be a very important tool. I want to end with, just in case you didn't know, and actually Ida, who's on this call, is part of this Convergence team. We have this Convergence Columbus initiative that we're working on right now, and it's a collective impact initiative to try to increase the Black homeownership rate by collaborating on key challenges. And so we're partnering with real estate professionals, nonprofit organizations, banks, researchers, the city, the county, the state, to try to really close the Black homeownership gap here in Columbus. And we're focusing not just on, one thing. We're trying to focus on information gaps, trust gaps, the market gap, which includes things like, the cost of housing right now. And it also includes the products that are available and the resource gap. And so we have several different work streams that people might be involved in that are on this call, that are trying to look across the board, not just on getting people into homes, but also on helping people, maximize the wealth in their homes to reduce this racial wealth disparity here in Columbus. And so if you're interested, reach out to Ida if you're a real estate professional. I'm sure she can get you engaged. And another thing I'll put a plug for, we're going to be sending out a survey soon to survey all of the real estate professionals on what you see as the big gaps right now, and how can we as Convergence help address some of those gaps among your consumers to kind of really reduce this racial wealth gap here in Columbus. So watch for that survey to come out as well in the coming weeks. So I think that's all I have. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing.
That was spectacular. A lot of really good comments about this research. And we do have some questions. I think we answered, or you answered, Stephanie, Glennon's question about earlier data by race with that following slide. But the next question, Sharon is asking to help understand the model that if all things remain constant, Black and brown people still are at a disadvantage. How and why? Sharon, anything else that you'd add to that question?
No, I just was taken back when I heard you say that, because I think the conversation sometimes is if everything was the same,
right,
things would change. And so when you said opposite, I wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. Help me understand the why on that, because I'm just not connecting how that's not moving us to what we're looking for in terms of equality.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times we think if we just increase credit scores, then that's going to make everything better. So the reason that we see this disparate rate of homeownership, or that we see disparities in refinancing, it's because, there are systematically lower credit scores for people who are Black than people who are white. So maybe that's the whole story. And if we could just fix that, if we give them credit counseling and education, we're going to be good. What the data show is that isn't the whole reason. So, there's a lot more to it than that. And even for two people that have the exact same credit score, refinancing rates are lower. And so it suggests that there's this information trust gap potentially. And quite frankly, first generation homeowners. I mean, it may be lack of, if you're a first generation homeowner, you may not know that you can actually refinance your mortgage when interest rate drops and save money. And you've been predatory scams that servicers have had, and you may have been the victim of a predatory scam. And so, there's a lot of reason people don't trust their bank and don't necessarily want to reach out and refinance. And unfortunately, I mean, this might be good from an investor perspective because people aren't refinancing when rates drop. And so the investors get to, benefit from this. But this isn't good from a wealth creation standpoint. And so credit score and income definitely still explain part of the gap. I don't want to say that we should definitely focus on increasing incomes. We should focus on increasing wealth. We should focus on increasing credit. But we also need to think about, how do we actually create access to information and access to products and make this more streamlined? Because simply educating people, giving them better credit isn't necessarily going to get us all the way there, if that makes sense.
It's a spectacular question, Sharon. I'm going to turn it over just for a moment. If anyone who's just listening and do not have access to dropping a question into the chat, if anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask, please do right now. And Melissa, I'm looking for, keep an eye on that for me if you don't mind, Ida and Kelsey. But Stephanie, I have a question that is, your research, you're one person, obviously, you're doing a lot of research right now. If you had unlimited funding and time, what subjects would you like to research? I'm asking that in the spirit of every single one of the individuals listed in today are subject matter experts. I would like to think that maybe Sharon, you could be Point, or Ida, or Kelsey, or Brent, but if anyone has something they've been thinking about of the realtors listening in, your boots on the ground, and you think this could be a really interesting subject for Stephanie and her team at Ohio State to study, connect to the realtors or connect directly to Stephanie, because I think that's where we have an openness, and an awareness of these inequities. And I think we definitely have a willingness to research. So with that, Stephanie, if you were to say, you know, unlimited funding, unlimited time, what would you like to study next?
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful question. I mean, I would like to hear from the real estate professionals what they see on the ground, because I think that's huge. You know, I think there are different initiatives and products. This gap has been persistent for decades, and we need to rethink the whole system. I think we need to rethink the structure, how we're going about mortgage financing and how we're going about trying to close that gap. And I'm worried that we've been kind of skirting around the edges with different things, and we haven't really fundamentally addressed the issues of wealth disparities. And, you know, one of the things I think is it takes wealth to create wealth almost, unfortunately. So if you think about right now competing in a market, trying to make an offer on a home, if you don't have $25,000 that you could use for gap appraisal financing, you may miss out on a purchase, right? And so for that first time home buyer that's coming into the market, you know, they can't compete. And so I don't think we talk about this enough. I think we talk about like down payment and closing cost assistance, which might be, you know, a couple $1,000s, but that's not going to be enough to kind of close this gap. I think we need to think. And so I would love to research some, you know, one of the things I'm working with Convergence and a few others is what are some really cool, innovative products or designs we could come up with that could really transform the way we think about this and not just try to do things on the margin. So I think there is need for structural change and new product innovation. I think there are some folks that are getting appetite to do that. We see special purpose credit programs are something that I have some hope for. You know, they could be transformational if they're done correctly. If you're familiar, special purpose credit programs basically allow a bank to design a product for people who are Black, recognizing that, you know, we've had structural systematic inequities that have discriminated against federal policy, even that has kind of created these inequities. And so rather than viewing it as you can't make loans based on race, doing it the opposite way. Yeah, you can actually make a loan that's going to invest in the Black community because we know about these structural disparities. So I think I would love to know more, you know, you know, really researching and understanding these special purpose credit programs and seeing if they're actually able to do something that we haven't been able to do for the past 50 years, which is kind of reform how we think about, you know, financing home purchases. So yeah, that's, I guess, if I were to say one thing, that's one thing I would mention. Yeah.
That's a fantastic correlation to some work that I'm doing. I love social entrepreneurialism. I love the idea where you take something that is an absolute, you know, attainable, if you put the right minds together and have some funding, especially societal goal. And there are a couple of programs, especially out of state right now, that I have my eye on that have gotten a lot of seed money, big seed money, because they're very thoughtfully going to the root of some inequities, and banking is a huge area. You know, here in this office, just to give a kind of an example, that just, it wasn't nefarious, but it was just, it was because of structural problems that resulted from really 07 and 08 and regulations that made it very difficult to lend credit to individuals who, like during PPP, during the initial fallout of COVID, the same banks who were regulated for extending credit to individuals, or overextending credit, I should say, to individuals who were not able to back it up with the right income, those same banks were asked to be the panacea and all of a sudden distribute PPP to individuals. And it was almost the inverse, right, of 08 and 07, 08, 09 period. My office, we spent a lot of time looking at that data. That was a good example of the power of just shining some light on inequities. The first tranche of PPP that went out to the Central Ohio folks was the exact opposite of what we kind of wanted it to do. And so every single Wednesday evening, just so happens that the regional bank presidents happen to be women right now. But every Wednesday evening we met about 5 p.m. and we talked thoughtfully and openly and asked questions. Why were the individuals that really needed help? Why were they not able to get access to PPP? And we know the complexity. It was extremely tedious. And if you're not sure where your next paycheck is going to come from, rent or food on the table for your family, you're sure as heck probably not going to be able to go find old tax forms and fill out lengthy, complicated applications. And so we looked at what things that we had control over locally, and we worked with some community partners. There was also a tremendous fear as to government's role, and was there a catch to those funds? But we were not the best conduit for that. Instead, our nonprofit community was. And so I'm very pleased to say by the third tranche, the inverse of the first tranche occurred. and it went to the individuals really where we needed to support that cash flow. And that's just a testament to everyone had a willingness to make some changes. We just had to make sure we had the right blueprint. And thankfully, some data allowed us to do that. The same thing I think happens in housing, and this is part of the reason why we're having this conversation. Deborah brings up a very important point that we're simply not building the number of starter homes that we need to. And Stephanie, you referenced your research on simply the supply of new builds. I know you didn't have a slide for that, but do you want to speak to that just maybe anecdotally?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue here in Columbus, so obviously, I had a slide that shows how housing prices have increased in Columbus just, exponentially, as you all know. And part of the reason why housing prices are increasing is because we have more demand than supply. And we particularly don't have supply of affordable homes that are at a price point that, first-time home buyers could actually purchase. So that's a huge issue here in Columbus, and figuring out what the right mix of policy solutions are to address that, mix with private sector solutions is a whole, another conversation, I think, but we can't forget that. I mean, I think, on one hand, increasing house prices are a wonderful thing for people that own their homes and are seeing that equity increase. That's a huge, benefit, but for people that are kind of trying to get into the market for the first time, that can be a barrier. And so thinking about subsidies in creative ways to help people be able to get into this market where things are accelerating at a really fast pace, I think is important. And then, increasing the supply of housing as well, I think is a huge question that we need to be thinking about, and afford in housing at a rate that at a price that people can purchase. We in economics, they talk about like housing just filters down. If you build the big houses, it'll filter down, but it may not be doing that at the right rate, and so we end up with this really disparate situation where first generation home buyers just can't get in the market right now.
Questions are pouring in now, and Janice, you bring up a very good point. You feel like the lack of focus on the seller side of things is a missed opportunity. So as educating the seller and helping them understand these disparities in cash access when they are selecting their offers could make them more open to FHA and any other new finance programs that come about. It's a great point, Janice. Any reflection, Stephanie, on that?
Huge point. I mean, I think to your point, you talked about administrative burden, Megan, a second ago with, the forms. And I think, there's this myth that an FHA home buyer is always going to be more complicated and it's going to make the deal fall through. There may be some truth in that historically, and there may be some additional administrative burdens, but by and large, a lot of that is a myth. And so then you end up with, in first-time home buyers, people of color are much more likely to use FHA loans. And so you end up, it's discrimination is what's happening. But the seller has the ability to say, I'm not going to take the transaction that has an FHA mortgage associated with it. And that is just exacerbating this issue. So that is a huge problem. We see that with down payment assistance programs too. Anytime that there's, something that might add a friction to that process when you're in a really hot market like you are right now. And I agree. I think it is about educating sellers. I think it's about and hopefully, sellers agents too can maybe play a role in helping to kind of, promote, raise this discussion. But for sure, it's a huge part of the issue right now, not just in Columbus, but other places as well, where FHA is now, I had a paper on this about a decade ago where we were suspecting that people that had FHA mortgages were going to end up paying more for their homes. And so we actually were finding a little bit of that, where there's like sellers basically aren't as willing to negotiate down the price when there's an FHA mortgage involved. This was like a decade ago. And now it's pretty much commonly known that this is actually happening. And we thought it was pretty controversial at the time when we were finding this. We were like, this is something we're seeing. This seems to be true. And now you talk to any of you and you're like, well, yeah, that's exactly true. They're not going to negotiate on and right now negotiations aren't happening by and large, but in any case, this kind of stigma of FHA has been around for a while, but it's definitely gotten worse in a really hot market.
It's a great question, Janice. I'd ask, how do we ensure that benefits, i.e. wealth, of the new GED to PhD jobs at Intel are equitably distributed? That's a spectacular question. And, she's thinking transportation, housing, awareness, et cetera. I very, very quickly from the cities, of Columbus, equitable infrastructure is a North Star. I think beyond the city, who does this the best is our library. Columbus Metropolitan Library does a spectacular job of ensuring that sometimes, I think very thoughtfully, library services are put at a neighborhood level. And so they really do try and match library, its services, what the library stands for with the community that it's going in. And I think they just do a spectacular job. The city of Columbus in the Central Ohio region, we're complicated by the fact that we have so many different types of government. There's a new township, there's a government, there's different cities, there's all kinds of layers. And so when you're doing something regionally like a transportation program, think about the number of governments that it would run from just here to where Intel is, and you have to get everyone's buy-in. But I would like to think that, at least from the city of Columbus right now, the idea of affordability is a North Star, and trying to find as much as we can, even out that playing field. It's a great question. Tom suggests his question, is there any thought given to the possibility there's cultural differences in the perspective and desire to own and maintain real estate, despite potential long-term benefits to building wealth? Tom reports that he's not seen all people share the same desire to own property. I think, Tom, that's a very good point, especially for families maybe who are trying to figure out where their homes are going to be, whether it be Columbus or someplace else. Stephanie, any anecdotal thought that you have to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think the part of the challenge is that we do see that Black homeowners are wanting to own homes, in the sense that, you can see the mortgage denial rate gap that I showed, where there's a 14 percentage point denial rate gap. So these are people, so one explanation is that there's just not a preference to own. So maybe part of this is just simply that there's not a preference to own, that people would rather rent with different backgrounds, and that explains it. It doesn't seem to be held up in data. It does seem like you do have, people who are Black that are seeking mortgages that are getting denied at a disparate rate too. So while there could be some of that, and it could be also, you raise a good point about like intergenerational transfer of information about buying homes. Absolutely, that can be it. If you're a first generation homeowner, a lot of my work tries to focus on first generation homeowners and how do we build supports for first generation homeowners, because they simply don't have the parent to call up who can tell them what to do when the water heater breaks. And so they may end up charging it to their credit card, for example, not because they need a water heater and they may not realize that there's low income, low cost alternatives available to be able to try to finance that. And so I think it's a really important question. I think it's a really nuanced question, because I think one could interpret it to say, well, maybe there's just not a preference for owning. That doesn't seem to be held up in the data. You even can see surveys of, would you like to own your home someday? And you don't see this big discrepancy in preferences for owning. But on the other hand, the knowledge about the process is often passed on from generation to generation. And if we have these structural inequities, then that knowledge isn't being passed on in the same way. And so I think that there's some intergenerational transfer of information that may be different.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. We've got some other questions, good questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Brent Swander to close things out.
Thank you, Auditor. You're exactly right. Great plug for Leadership Academy, by the way. Those of you who have not participated in Leadership Academy, this is where 9-month, I should say, extensive program to learn more about our community, and that Columbus Realtors is more than just selling homes or selling property, that our members truly give back to the community. And for that, we're thankful for all that you do. The auditor and I struck up a conversation. As she mentioned, many of you are very familiar with what the county auditor does, but I don't think many of our members really understand the impact that the city auditor has on your day-to-day business in our industry as well. So, Auditor, thank you. Stephanie, a huge thank you to you as well. I would be remiss if I did not thank our entire team of Kelsey, Ida, I don't want to miss anybody, Kelsey, Ida, Lynn, Jules, Kelly, Sharon, Raquel, thank you for all that you did to put this on. I have so many thoughts on this entire program. The affordability, I just came from a One Columbus breakfast this morning where the talk was Intel, right? Stephanie hit the nail on the head: supply and demand, supply and demand, supply and demand. It's economics 101, right? I had a member of Congress call me right after Christmas and said, hey, Brent, what are first-time home buyers doing? So it's a great question. they're sitting on the sidelines. If their parents do have the capital and the means, they are paying cash and then refinancing. I had a realtor member tell me yesterday, you need more cash to buy a house today than you ever have before. And I never really actually thought about it that way until Stephanie, talks about appraisal gaps and all the other cash that is being thrown at properties today. So where does that leave our underserved and underprivileged first-time home buyers and buyers in general? It's something that we have to think about very seriously. As I often say, DE&I is a journey. As a kid who grew up in a very small town in rural Northwest Ohio, it's certainly a journey for me. But I think the way I look at this is change requires education. Change in action requires education. That is what we are here to hopefully do today, is to educate some of our members. As I look across the screen, there are a lot of names I don't know. And that's incredibly encouraging. So thank you for those of you who attended today. Again, Stephanie, Megan, our entire team, thank you for all that you do. We have a lot of challenges, but with those challenges certainly comes opportunity. Stephanie and Megan also mentioned public-private partnerships. When I talked to the press today about Intel, and we're talking about Intel, we're not even talking about all the other opportunities and job creators that are moving to Central Ohio. We have a lot of opportunity. I often say public-private partnerships are what brought Intel. Now it's public-private partnerships that have to deliver. And it's not just Intel, it's across the spectrum, but I think today really opened so many eyes of the true cost of inequality. And so with that, I'll just leave it there and say thank you very much.